Chapter 9 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 9. Joe went to bed that night with a promise to himself to rise early next morning, for he had been invited to take part in a raising, which term meant that a new cabin was to be erected, and such task was ever an event in the lives of the settlers. The following morning Joe rose early, dressing himself in a complete buckskin suit, for which he had exchanged his good garments of cloth. Never before had he felt so comfortable. He wanted to hop, skip, and jump. The soft, undressed buckskin was as warm and smooth as silk plush, the weight so light, the moccasins so well-fitting and springy, that he had to put himself under considerable restraint to keep from capering about like a frolicsome colt. The possession of this buckskin outfit, and the rifle and accouterments which went with the bargain, marked the last stage in Joe's surrender to the border fever. The silent, shaded glens, the mystery of the woods, the breath of this wild, free life claimed him from this moment entirely and forever. He met the others, however, with a serene face, showing no trace of the emotion which welled up strongly from his heart. Nell glanced shyly at him. Kate playfully voiced her admiration. Jim met him with a brotherly ridicule, which bespoke his affection as well as his amusement. But Colonel Zane, having once yielded to the same burning, riotous craving for freedom which now stirred in the boy's heart, understood, and felt warmly drawn toward the lad. He said nothing, though as he watched Joe his eyes were grave and kind. In his long frontier life, where many a day measured the life and fire of ordinary years, he had seen lad after lad go down before this forest fever. It was well, he thought, because the freedom of the soil depended on these wild, light-footed boys. Yet it always made him sad. How many youths, his brother among them, lay under the fragrant pine-needle carpet of the forest in their last earthly sleep. The raising brought out all the settlement, the women to look on and gossip while the children played, the men to bend their backs in the moving of the heavy timbers. They celebrated the erection of a new cabin as a noteworthy event. As a social function, it had a prominent place in the settlers' short list of pleasures. Joe watched the proceedings with the same pleasure and surprise he had felt in everything pertaining to border life. To him this log-raising appeared the hardest kind of labor, yet it was plain these hardy men, these low-voiced women, and married children regarded the work as something far more significant than the mere building of a cabin. After a while he understood the meaning of the scene. A kindred spirit, the spirit of the pioneer, drew them all into one large family. This was another cabin, another home, another advance toward the conquering of the wilderness, for which these brave men and women were giving their lives. In the bright-eyed children's glee, when they clapped their little hands at the mounting logs, Joe saw the progress, the march of civilization. "Well, I'm sorry you're to leave us tonight," remarked Colonel Zane to Joe, as the young man came over to where he, his wife, and sister watched the work. "Jonathan said all was ready for your departure at sundown." "Do we travel by night?" "Indeed, yes, my lad. There are Indians everywhere on the river. I think, however, with Jack and Lou handling the paddles, you will slip by safely. The plan is to keep along the south shore all night, then cross over at a place called Girty's Point, where you are to remain in hiding during daylight. From there you paddle up Yellow Creek, then portage across country to the head of the Tuscarawas. Another night's journey will then bring you to the Village of Peace." Jim and Mr. Wells, with his nieces, joined the party now, and all stood watching as the last logs were put in place. "Colonel Zane, my first log raising is an education to me," said the young minister in his earnest manner. "This scene is so full of life. I never saw such good will among laboring men. Look at that brawny-armed giant standing on the topmost log. How he whistles as he swings his axe! Mr. Wells, does it not impress you? The pioneers must be brothers because of their isolation and peril. To be brothers means to love one another. To love one another is to love God. What you see in this fraternity is God, and I want to see the same beautiful feeling among the Indians." "I have seen it," said Colonel Zane to the old missionary. "When I came out here alone 12 years ago, the Indians were peaceable. If the pioneers had paid for land as I paid Corn Planter, there would never have been a border war. But no, the settlers must grasp every acre they could. Then the Indians rebelled, then the Girtys and their allies spread discontent, and now the border is a bloody warpath." "Have the Jesuit missionaries accomplished anything with these war tribes?" inquired Jim. "No, their work has been chiefly among the Indians near Detroit and northward. The Hurons, Delawares, Shawnees, and other western tribes have been demoralized by the French traders' run, and incited to fierce hatred by Girty and his renegades. Your work at Gnaddenhutten must be among these hostile tribes, and it is surely a hazardous undertaking." "My life is God's," murmured the old minister. No fear could assail his steadfast faith. "Jim, it strikes me you'd be more likely to impress these Indians Colonel Zane spoke of if you'd get a suit like mine and wear a knife and tomahawk," interposed Joe cheerfully. "Then, if you couldn't convert, you could scalp them." "Well, well, let us hope for the best," said Colonel Zane, when the laughter had subsided. "We'll go over to dinner now. Come, all of you. Jonathan, bring Wetzel. Betty, make him come, if you can." As the party slowly wended its way toward the colonel's cabin, Jim and Nell found themselves side by side. They had not exchanged a word since the evening previous, when Jim had kissed her. Unable to look at each other now, and finding speech difficult, they walked in embarrassed silence. "Doesn't Joe look splendid in his hunting suit?" asked Jim presently. "I hadn't noticed. Yes, he looks well," replied Nell carelessly. She was too indifferent to be natural. "Are you angry with him?" "Certainly not." Jim was always simple and frank in his relations with women. He had none of his brother's fluency of speech, with neither confidence, boldness, nor understanding of the intricate mazes of a woman's moods. "But you are angry with me?" he whispered. Nell flushed to her temples, yet she did not raise her eyes nor reply. "It was a terrible thing for me to do," went on Jim, hesitatingly. "I don't know why I took advantage of your mistaking me for Joe. If you only hadn't held up your mouth No, I don't mean that. Of course you didn't. But, well, I couldn't help it. I'm guilty. I have thought of little else. Some wonderful feeling has possessed me ever since What has Joe been saying about me?" demanded Nell, her eyes burning like opals. "Why, hardly anything," answered Jim haltingly. "I took him to task about what I considered might be wrong to you. Joe has never been very careful of young ladies' feelings, and I thought Well, it was none of my business. He said he honestly cared for you, that you had taught him how unworthy he was of a good woman. But he's wrong there. Joe is wild and reckless, yet his heart is a well of gold. He is a diamond in the rough. Just now he is possessed by wild notions of hunting Indians and roaming through the forests, but he'll come round all right. I wish I could tell you how much he has done for me, how much I love him, how I know him. He can be made worthy of any woman. He will outgrow this fiery, daring spirit, and then won't you help him?" "I will, if he will let me," softly whispered Nell, irresistibly drawn by the strong, earnest love thrilling in his voice. End of Chapter 9 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Chapter 10 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 10. Once more out under the blue-black vault of heaven, with its myriads of twinkling stars, the voyagers resumed their westward journey. Whispered farewells of new but sincere friends lingered in their ears. Now the great looming bulk of the fort above them faded into the obscure darkness, leaving a feeling as if a protector had gone, perhaps forever. Admonished to absolute silence by the stern guides, who seemed indeed to have embarked upon a dark and deadly mission, the voyagers lay back in the canoes and thought and listened. The water eddied with soft gurgles in the wake of the racing canoes, but that musical sound was all they heard. The paddles might have been shadows for all the splash they made. They cut the water swiftly and noiselessly. Onward the frail barks glided into black space, side by side, close under the overhanging willows. Long moments passed into long hours, as the guides paddled tirelessly, as if their sinews were cords of steel. With gray dawn came the careful landing of the canoes, a cold breakfast eaten under cover of a willow thicket, and the beginning of a long day while they were lying hidden from the keen eyes of Indian scouts, waiting for the friendly mantle of night. The hours dragged until once more the canoes were launched, this time not on the broad Ohio, but on a stream that mirrored no shining stars as it flowed still and somber under the dense foliage. The voyagers spoke not, nor whispered, nor scarcely moved, so menacing had become the slow, listening caution of Wetzel and Zane. Snapping of twigs somewhere in the inscrutable darkness delayed them for long moments. Any moment the air might resound with the horrible Indian war whoop. Every second was heavy with fear. How marvelous that these scouts, penetrating the wilderness of gloom, glided on surely, silently, safely. Instinct, or the eyes of the lynx, guide their course. But another dark night wore on to the tardy dawn, and each of its fearful hours numbered miles past and gone. The sun was rising in ruddy glory when Wetzel ran his canoe into the bank just ahead of a sharp bend in the stream. "Do we get out here?" asked Jim, seeing Jonathan turn his canoe toward Wetzel's. "The village lies yonder, round the bend," answered the guide. "Wetzel cannot go there, so I'll take you all in my canoe." "There's no room. I'll wait," replied Joe quietly. Jim noticed his look. A strange, steady glance it was, and then saw him fix his eyes upon Nell, watching her until the canoe passed around the green-bordered bend in the stream. Unmistakable signs of an Indian town were now evident. Dozens of graceful birchen canoes lay upon the well-cleared banks. A log bridge spanned the stream. Above the slight ridge of rising ground could be seen the poles of Indian teepees. As the canoe grated upon the sandy beach, a little Indian boy who was playing in the shallow water raised his head and smiled. "That's an Indian boy," whispered Kate. "The dear little fellow!" exclaimed Nell. The boy came running up to them when they were landed, with pleasure and confidence shining in his dusky eyes. Save for tiny buckskin breeches, he was naked, and his shiny skin gleamed gold bronze in the sunlight. He was a singularly handsome child. "Me, Benny," he lisped in English, holding up his little hand to Nell. The action was as loving and trusting as any that could have been manifested by a white child. Jonathan Zane stared with a curious light in his dark eyes. Mr. Wells and Jim looked as though they doubted the evidence of their own sight. Here, even in an Indian boy, was incontestable proof that the savage nature could be tamed and civilized. With a tender exclamation, Nell bent over the child and kissed him. Jonathan Zane swung his canoe upstream for the purpose of bringing Joe. The trim little bark slipped out of sight around the bend. Presently its gray, curved nose peeped from behind the willows. Then the canoe swept into view again. There was only one person in it, and that the guide. "Where is my brother?" asked Jim in amazement. "Gone," answered Zane quietly. "Gone? What do you mean? Gone? Perhaps you have missed the spot where you left him." "They are both gone." Nell and Jim gazed at each other with slowly whitening faces. "Come, I'll take you up to the village," said Zane, getting out of his canoe. All noticed that he was careful to take his weapons with him. "Can't you tell us what it means, this disappearance?" asked Jim, his voice low and anxious. "They're gone, canoe and all. I knew Wetzel was going, but I didn't calculate on the lad. Maybe he followed Wetzel, maybe he didn't," answered the taciturn guide, and he spoke no more. In his keen expectation and wonder as to what the village would be like, Jim momentarily forgot his brother's disappearance, and when he arrived at the top of the bank he surveyed the scene with eagerness. What he saw was more imposing than the village of peace which he had conjured up in his imagination. Confronting him was a level plain, in the center of which stood a wide, low structure surrounded by log cabins, and these in turn encircled by Indian teepees. A number of large trees, mostly full-foliaged maples, shaded the clearing. The settlement swarmed with Indians. A few shrill hellos, uttered by the first observers of the newcomers, brought braves, maidens, and children trooping toward the party with friendly curiosity. Jonathan Zane stepped before a cabin adjoining the large structure and called in at the open door. A short, stoop-shouldered white man, clad in faded linsey, appeared on the threshold. His serious, lined face had the unmistakable, benevolent aspect peculiar to most teachers of the gospel. "Mr. Zeisberger, I fetched a party from Fort Henry," said Zane, indicating those he had guided. Then, without another word, never turning his dark face to the right or left, he hurried down the lane through the throng of Indians. Jim remembered, as he saw the guide vanish over the bank of the creek, that he had heard Colonel Zane say that Jonathan, as well as Wetzel, hated the sight of an Indian. No doubt long years of war and bloodshed had rendered these two great hunters callous. To them there could be no discrimination. An Indian was an Indian. "Mr. Wells, welcome to the village of peace," exclaimed Mr. Zeisberger, wringing the old missionary's hand. "The years have not been so long but that I remember you." "Happy indeed am I to get here after all these dark, dangerous journeys," returned Mr. Wells. "I have brought my nieces, Nell and Kate, who were children when you left Williamsburg, and this young man, James Downs, a minister of God, and earnest in his hope for our work." "A glorious work it is. Welcome, young ladies, to our peaceful village. And, young man, I greet you with heartfelt thankfulness. We need young men. Come in, all of you, and share my cabin. I'll have your luggage brought up. I have lived in this hut alone. With some little labor and the magic touch women bring to the making of a home, we can be most comfortable here." Mr. Zeisberger gave his own room to the girls, assuring them with a smile that it was the most luxurious in the village. The apartment contained a chair, a table, and a bed of Indian blankets and buffalo robes. A few pegs driven in the chinks between the logs completed the furnishings. Sparse as were the comforts, they appealed warmly to the girls, who, weary from their voyage, lay down to rest. "I am not fatigued," said Mr. Wells to his old friend. "I want to hear all about your work, what you have done, and what you hope to do." "We have met with wonderful success, far beyond our wildest dreams," responded Mr. Zeisberger. "Certainly we have been blessed of God." Then the missionary began a long, detailed account of the Moravian mission's efforts among the western tribes. The work lay chiefly among the Delawares, a noble nation of red men, intelligent and wonderfully susceptible to the teaching of the gospel. Among the eastern Delawares, living on the other side of the Allegheny Mountains, The missionaries had succeeded in converting many, and it was chiefly through the western explorations of Frederick Post that his church decided the Indians of the West could as well be taught to lead Christian lives. The first attempt to convert the western redmen took place upon the upper Allegheny, where many Indians, including Alamewi, a blind Delaware chief, accepted the faith. The mission decided, however, it would be best to move farther west, where the Delawares had migrated and were more numerous. In April 1770, more than 10 years before, 16 canoes, filled with converted Indians and missionaries, drifted down the Allegheny to Fort Pitt, thence down the Ohio to the Big Beaver, up that stream and far into the Ohio wilderness. Upon a tributary of the Muskingong, called the Tuscarawas, a settlement was founded. Near and far the news was circulated. Red men from all tribes came flocking to the new colony. Chiefs and warriors, squaws and maidens, were attracted by the new doctrine of the converted Indians. They were astonished at the missionaries' teachings. Many doubted. Some were converted. All listened. Great excitement prevailed when old Glickhican, one of the wisest chiefs of the Turtle tribe of the Delawares, became a convert to the palefaces' religion. The interest widened, and in a few years a beautiful, prosperous town arose, which was called Village of Peace. The Indians of the warlike tribes bestowed the appropriate name. The vast forests were rich in every variety of game. The deep, swift streams were teeming with fish. Meat and grain in abundance, buckskin for clothing, and soft furs for winter garments were to be had for little labor. At first only a few wigwams were erected. Soon a large log structure was thrown up and used as a church. Then followed a school, a mill, and a workshop. The verdant fields were cultivated and surrounded by rail fences. Horses and cattle grazed with the timid deer on the grassy plains. The Village of Peace blossomed as a rose. The reports of the love and happiness existing in this converted community spread from mouth to mouth, from town to town, with the result that inquisitive savages journeyed from all points to see this haven. Peaceful and hostile Indians were alike amazed at the change in their brethren. The good fellowship and industry of the converts had a widespread and wonderful influence. More, perhaps, than any other thing, the great fields of waving corn, the hills covered with horses and cattle, those evidences of abundance, impressed the visitors with the well-being of the Christians. Bands of traveling Indians, whether friendly or otherwise, were treated with hospitality and never sent away empty-handed. They were asked to partake of the abundance and solicited to come again. A feature by no means insignificant in the popularity of the village was the church bell. The Indians loved music, and this bell charmed them. On still nights the savages in distant towns could hear at dusk the deep-toned, mellow notes of the bell summoning the worshipers to the evening service. Its ringing clang, so strange, so sweet, so solemn, breaking the vast dead wilderness quiet, haunted the savage ear as though it were a call from a woodland god. "You have arrived most opportunely," continued Mr. Zeisberger. "Mr. Edwards and Mr. Young are working to establish other missionary posts. Heckewelder is here now in the interest of this branching out." "How long will it take me to learn the Delaware language?" inquired Jim. "Not long. You do not, however, need to speak the Indian tongue, for we have excellent interpreters." "We heard much at Fort Pitt and Fort Henry about the danger as well as uselessness of our venture," Jim continued. "The frontiersmen declared that every rod of the way was beset with savage foes, and that even in the unlikely event of our arriving safely at the Village of Peace, we would then be hemmed in by fierce, vengeful tribes. Hostile savages abound here, of course, but we do not fear them. We invite them. Our work is to convert the wicked
to teach them to lead good, useful lives. We will succeed."
Jim could not help warming to the minister for his unswervable faith, his earnest belief that the work of God could not fail. Nevertheless, while he felt no fear, and intended to put all his heart in the work, he remembered with disquietude Colonel Zane's warnings. He thought of the wonderful precaution and eternal vigilance of Jonathan and Wetzel, men of all men who most understood Indian craft and cunning. It might well be possible that these good missionaries, wrapped up in saving the souls of these children of the forest, so full of God's teachings as to have little mind for aught else, had no knowledge of the Indian nature beyond what the narrow scope of their work invited. If what these frontiersmen asserted was true, then the minister's zeal had struck them blind. Jim had a growing idea of the way in which the savages could be best taught. He resolved to go slowly, to study the redmen's natures, not to preach one word of the gospel to them until he had mastered their language and could convey to their simple minds the real truth. He would make Christianity as clear to them as were the deer trails on the moss and leaves of the forest.
"Ah, here you are. I hope you have rested well," said Mr. Zeisberger, when at the conclusion of this long recital Nell and Kate came into the room.
"Thank you. We feel much better," answered Kate. The girls certainly looked refreshed. The substitution of clean gowns for their former travel-stained garments made a change that called forth the minister's surprise and admiration.
My! Won't Edwards and Young beg me to keep them here now?" he exclaimed, his pleased eyes resting on Nell's piquant beauty and Kate's noble proportions and rich coloring. "Come, I will show you over the village of peace."
"Are all these Indians Christians?" asked Jim.
"No, indeed. These Indians you see here, and out yonder under the shade, though they are friendly, they are not Christians. Our converts employ themselves in the fields or shops. Come, take a peep in here. This is where we preach in the evenings and during inclement weather. On pleasant days we use the maple grove yonder."
Jim and the others looked in at the door of the large log structure. They saw an immense room, the floor covered with benches, and a raised platform at one end. A few windows let in the light. Spacious and barn-like was this apartment, but undoubtedly, seen through the beaming eyes of the missionary, it was a grand amphitheater for worship. The hard-packed clay floor was velvet carpet, the rude seats soft as eiderdown, the platform with its white oak cross, an altar of marble and gold.
"This is one of our shops," said Mr. Zeisberger, leading them to a cabin. "Here we make brooms, harness for the horses, farming implements, everything useful that we can. We have a forge here. Behold, an Indian blacksmith."
The interior of the large cabin presented a scene of bustling activity. 20 or more Indians bent their backs in earnest employment. In one corner a savage stood holding a piece of red-hot iron on an anvil, while a brawny brave wielded a sledgehammer. The sparks flew, the anvil rang. In another corner a circle of braves sat around a pile of dried grass and flags. They were twisting and fashioning these materials into baskets. At a bench 3 Indian carpenters were pounding and sawing. Young braves ran back and forth, carrying pails, rough-hewn boards, and blocks of wood. Instantly struck by 2 things, Jim voiced his curiosity. Why do these Indians all wear long hair, smooth and shiny, without adornment?
"They are Christians. They wear neither headdress, war bonnet, nor scalp lock," replied Mr. Zeisberger with unconscious pride.
"I did not expect to see a blacksmith's anvil out here in the wilderness. Where did you procure these tools?"
"We have been years gathering them here. Some came by the way of the Ohio River, others overland from Detroit. That anvil has a history. It was lost once and lay for years in the woods, until some Indians found it again. It is called the Ringing Stone, and Injuns come from miles around to see and hear it."
The missionary pointed out wide fields of corn, now growing yellow, and hillsides dotted with browsing cattle, droves of sturdy-limbed horses, and pens of fat, grunting pigs, all of which attested to the growing prosperity of the Village of Peace. On the way back to the cabin, while the others listened to and questioned Mr. Zeisberger, Jim was silent and thoughtful, for his thoughts reverted to his brother. Later, as he walked with Nell by the golden-fringed stream, he spoke of Joe. "Joe wanted so much to hunt with Wetzel. He will come back. Surely he will return to us when he has satisfied his wild craving for adventure. Do you not think so?" There was an eagerness that was almost pleading in Jim's voice. What he so much hoped for, that no harm had befallen Joe, and that he would return, he doubted. He needed the encouragement of his hope. "Never," answered Nell solemnly. "Oh, why do you say that?" "I saw him look at you, a strange, intent glance. He gazed long at me as we separated. Oh, I can feel his eyes. No, he will never come back." "Nell, you do not mean he went away deliberately because Oh, I cannot say it." "For no reason except that the wilderness called him more than love for you or me." "No, no," returned Jim, his face white. "You do not understand. He really loved you. I know it. He loved me, too. Ah, how well! He has gone because I can't tell you." "Oh, Jim, I hope he loved me," sobbed Nell, bursting into tears. "His coldness, his neglect those last few days hurt me so. If he cared, as you say, I won't be so miserable." "We are both right. You, when you say he will never return, and I, when I say he loved us both," said Jim sadly, as the bitter certainty forced itself into his mind. As she sobbed softly, and he gazed with set, stern face into the darkening forest, the deep, mellow notes of the church bell pealed out. So thrilled, so startled were they by this melody wondrously breaking the twilight stillness, that they gazed mutely at each other. Then they remembered. It was the missionary's bell summoning the Christian Indians to the evening service. End of Chapter 10 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio.